This video is going to be my full review of the 2018 Giant Trance Advanced 1. I've done a first look, a first ride, and after 8 months of riding, it's time to do a full-on review of this bike. First, a quick shout out to my local bike shop, Bike Works of Gainesville in Gainesville, Florida. They are a big supporter of my YouTube channel and they are an authorized Giant dealer, so if you're looking for a bike like this, check them out. So I'm filming this review in Blue Ridge, Georgia, which is one of my favorite testing grounds for bikes like this. So I'll be talking about how this bike does in the mountains as well as how it rides on my flatter local trails. I'm going to break down this review by going over the individual components and then talking about the whole ride quality of the bike. I'll start with the mods that I've made. So I did change out the saddle. The stock saddle was okay, but I found it to cause some pressure points, and I really love these WTB Silverado saddles, and this one is very comfortable. Another minor modification that I made was I changed out the stock Giant grips for these ESI foam grips, which are my favorite grips. Not only are they light, they're also very comfortable. And finally, I changed out the stock tires, which were Maxxis high rollers, for these Schwalbe Knobby Nicks 2.6. And so I find that 2.6 is about the sweet spot for me for a tire. I've tried plus bikes for all-around daily trail riding. I think plus bikes for me are a little bit too big, a little bit too heavy. It just is going to depend on where you ride, but for most of the trails that I ride, I like the 2.6s because they're more agile than a plus tire and they have more grip and more stability than a more narrow tire like a 2.35. I have not had any issues with mud packing up or anything like that. I mean, you don't have a ton of clearance left over, but it is still pretty good, and you have even more clearance up front for these 2.6 tires. The dropper seat post on this bike has worked really well. The operation is really smooth, and I've had really no problems with this dropper post. I really like the position of this thumb lever. So being down here instead of one where you have to push down on the top, it's a more natural reach. And I use this thing a lot. Even on long descents where it flattens out a little bit and I'm just kind of getting tired of standing, I want to sit down, maybe do a few pedal strokes. I'll pop the seat up and then push it right back down. I've said it before, dropper seat posts are those things that once you get used to riding a trail bike, it's really hard to not have one. It's pretty much a necessity on modern trail bikes today, and this is a good one. So this bike comes with Sram Eagle. It's the GX Eagle, so this is the bottom line Eagle, which is really just as smooth as the higher end Eagle components like the XO and the XX1. It's just a little bit heavier, but it has really been flawless on this bike. My first bike was Sram Eagle. I'm really impressed. The 50 tooth I obviously don't use when it's flatter, but riding up here in North Georgia you can get some really steep climbs, and I have used that really big 50 tooth cog in the back. Actually, this trip was the first time I used it because there were some walls that we had to climb, and so it really comes in handy. The GX Eagle shifter has worked really well too. No issues at all with the shifter. It's really smooth. The position of the thumb lever where you shift into a harder gear is a nice contour, really nice location. You don't have to bring your thumb up too high. So you know, again, the Sram Eagle shifting performance has been spot on. This bike comes with Sram Guide RS brakes, and so I just posted my video of comparing Shimano and Sram, and I mentioned that the brakes are really a matter of preference. This is really the first time I've gotten back on a bike with Sram brakes. I had some issues years and years ago with Sram brakes and went back to Shimano. But these have worked really well. You know, I'm going to repeat a little bit what I said in that last video that I posted of comparing Shimano and Sram, but these have really good modulation. They do not have the power, kind of the instant on feel that you get from Shimano. So again, it's a matter of preference. Some of the descents I was doing today, some of them were a little bit wet, and it was nice to have that modulation. It does take a little bit getting used to after you've been on Shimano for a while, because you'll feel like they don't have enough power, but it's just because when the pads start to make contact right about here, They don't grab quite as well as Shimano, so you might feel like you have to put a little bit more effort into the brakes. But the plus side of that, like I said, is that you have some really good modulation. In other words, you can regulate the power. This bike comes with a 780 wide bar. It's one, if you're riding cross country, it may seem a little wide, but once you get used to it, the leverage that you get from this bar is really good. Really wide bars, I find you lose a little bit of feedback from the trail, but you gain leverage. And so when you're bombing down rocky descents, so you have a little bit more control and power over the front wheel. And so I find this 780 is a really good spec for this bike. Giant went for years with putting bars that I think were a little bit too narrow on their trail bikes. They finally put a bar that is one that I think is appropriate width for a trail bike like this with 150 millimeters of travel. And speaking of travel, let's go ahead and talk about the Fox suspension. So it's got a 150 fork, and the rear travel is actually 140, so it's a little bit less in the rear than the front. The fork does not have the Kashima coating that I've had on some of my other trail bikes, but honestly, I haven't missed it. This fork is buttery smooth. It's got some really good adjustments. So this is the Elite, and so you do have on this fork, you have the ability to adjust your fully open setting with this black knob. And so you've got open, you've got kind of a middle setting that I use a lot for climbing, and then the fully locked out, and it is really locked out. So I'll use that for long gravel sections, especially up here in the mountains when you're climbing a gravel road for 30 minutes. It's really nice to lock out the suspension, because there are times you want to get out of the saddle and stand up, and with the fork locked out, you can do that without the fork wallowing up and down. The shock on this bike is a Fox DPX2 with the piggyback reservoir. It's actually my first shock using a piggyback reservoir, and I really like it. It's just extremely supple. The back wheel just stays glued to the ground when you're descending rough terrain. When I got up here, I actually had to go to a bike shop and borrow a shock pump. I forgot to bring my shock pump. It was one of the first times I forgot it, and was one of the first times I actually needed it on a bike trip. And so I had been riding this bike back at home without a camelback, and I really loaded up my camelback. It probably weighed 15 pounds, loaded down with water and tools and food. And so the sag was too high, and the shock really didn't feel good. So you got to nail the pressure. So I'm running pretty much what is my weight with the camelback on is the PSI I put in this shock. After I did that, it was really dialed in. It's a really supple feel when you're descending. So this is a great spec on this bike. I think this is the first mid-level Trance that has had the shock with a piggyback reservoir, and like I said, it's very smooth. Now, I did have an issue where the shock kind of was making a noise. I did air sleeve maintenance on the shock and changed the float fluid, and it's back to running smooth, noise-free. I love the fact that Giant specs carbon rims on these bikes. I pretty much only use carbon rims from here on out, just because I love the feel, I love the precision. They're a little bit more harsh than an aluminum rim, not much, and you can't notice it too much on a trail bike with this much travel, but the rims have had absolutely no issues. They seat up well as tubeless. Sometimes I've had some issues with Giant rims where it's hard to get a tire off. These are actually okay. I had the 2017 Trance, last year's, and that one was a bear to get tires off, but I don't know if they just came from a different mold or Giant has improved, but they are easier to get the tires off. They do lock in your tire really well, so you don't have to worry about the tires burping or anything like that. These tires and rim combination have held air perfectly. The Maestro suspension is one of my favorite types of suspension, and Giant recently have started making these rocker arms out of carbon, which has improved the weight a little bit, but really has improved the stiffness, the lateral stiffness. And so Maestro suspension is great because I don't have to think too much about locking out the shock. And by the way, let me go ahead and mention this knob. So it's fully forward is locked out. It does move a little bit. And then you've got kind of your pro pedal setting that I use for climbing, and then descending, I fully open it up. This knob is not as easy to reach on the shocks without the piggyback reservoir. So in those shocks, you've kind of got the knob in front. I find those a little bit easier to reach, but this one's not too bad. It's just you got to think a little bit more when you reach down to grab that knob. So back to Maestro. The thing that I really like about Maestro is when you're riding sections where you might have a steep climb followed by a descent and they're coming in rapid succession and you just don't want to think about having to reach down and open up that shock or even lock it out. I'll run it in the middle or even the open setting, and the Maestro suspension works really well to firm up the suspension when you're putting some good hard pedaling in. And then I find it when you're not pedaling to be one of the more plush suspensions. So it's really the best of both worlds, firm when you're pedaling and need it firm, and really opens up when you're not pedaling, i.e. when you're descending. And even when you're pedaling over rough terrain, it doesn't stiffen up the suspension too much, so it'll break free and absorb roots and rocks as you're pedaling. Now I'll talk about overall ride quality of the bike, starting with climbing. So it's a carbon frame, carbon wheels, bike with Maestro suspension, 27.5 pounds. That makes for a bike that climbs almost as good as a cross-country bike. So today I was riding with my son. He was kind of starting to drag a little bit on the climbs and a guy passed us. I let him get up the road a little bit on a gravel road, and then I just decided to put in a little dig and try to catch him. And this bike squirted up the climb, again, almost as good as my cross-country bike. And also when you're climbing up rough sections and you need a lot of grip, the Maestro suspension, like I had mentioned earlier, can really break free. So I run the shock in the middle setting when I'm climbing up rough stuff on trails, and the Maestro suspension does a good job of keeping the rear wheel on the ground and giving you traction as you're climbing. And of course, the real reason why I have a trail bike with this much travel is for the descents, and this bike does not disappoint on the descents. So it's plush, it's laterally stiff. When you're going through chunky sections, the bike holds its line so well because, you know, the front end's carbon and the wheels are carbon, and you've got boost spacing both on the rear and also on the front. And so all of that comes together to make this bike just a super fun descending bike. Are there any things that I don't like about this bike? Honestly, the only negative comment that I would have on this bike is the fact that you can have more pedal strikes. Now that's a trade-off. So everything with mountain biking is a trade-off. If you get, you know, skinny tires that are real nice and agile and climb well, they're not going to be good on descent. So you're trading off. This bike has a little bit lower bottom bracket, which helps the handling when you're descending on this bike and railing corners, even on flatter terrain. So my local trails are pretty flat, and I love the lower center of gravity when I'm hammering a corner. But that comes at a trade-off in the fact that you can have more pedal strikes. Another reason why you've got to nail the PSI in your rear shock. You do not want to run more than about, I'd say, 28 to 30% of sag in your rear shock. Anything more than that, you're going to be having a lot of pedal strikes. And if you're using a Camelback sometimes, I would run the shock at about 25% because of the weight of that Camelback. If you throw it on for a ride, you just don't want to be sagging the shock too much. So again, pedal strikes are a little bit of an issue, but it's by no means a deal breaker. I do like this fork with 34mm stanchion tubes. I think it's a good spec. However, I would be curious to see what this bike would ride like with a fork with 36mm stanchion tubes. I think it would make the descending even better. So that's not really a negative thing. It's just something that I'd be curious to try on this bike. So that'll wrap up my full review of the 2018 Giant Trance Advanced 1. Questions or comments, drop those below. Thanks for watching.